They were going to send it to us. I need to like nag them.
I was going to say, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues. There's lots of you online, lots of you. I mean, it's fabulous. Packed here into the Trinity Long Room Hub. I have to speak to the camera rather than the people who are behind me, so apologies in advance, but Jess will be chairing this. But my name's Jane Ohlmeyer. I'm the Erasmus Smith's Professor of Modern History here at Trinity, and I'm very privileged to be the co-PI on this really phenomenal Marie Curie program called Human Plus. And the whole point of Human Plus is putting the human at the centre of technological innovation. Now we have, I was going to say 1, 2, 3, 4 Human Plus fellows in Trinity. We're still recruiting more. The program is really, though, going to get going this year. And this is our TED Talk series, our Tech Talk series. What am I saying? Copied, of course, from the TED Talks. And it's really exciting because Kata is going to be sort of leading this first one, along with her 2 supervisors, Jennifer O'Mara, whom you'll hear from in film studies, and Aljosa. Where's Aljosa? Is he online?
He's online.
Oh, Aljosa, we're missing you in Dublin already. Aljosa from Computer Science. There you are. Nice to see you. But I'm really delighted because all I get to do is welcome everybody and say how we're excited we are about this series. And I'm going to be handing over to Jess Majekodunmi. Oh, yes. Pass. From Accenture. Now, it's been a real privilege to work with Accenture on this, Jess. So really, you and your colleague, particularly Ken, have been just a joy to work with. And it's great for me to be able to handing over to you the chair for this event. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jane. And now you can sit back and relax.
Have my lunch.
Thank you, everyone who are joining us in the room today and also online. So my name is Jess Majekodunmi. I am the director of the Human Sciences Studio at the DOC, which is Accenture's Global Innovation Centre. And we are delighted to collaborate on this because we have that same mission around putting the human at the centre of all things to do with innovation and technology. So I will be your chair for this discussion on identity and behaviour in the digital world. And we've got 3 great speakers lined up today. So we have Dr. Kata, Szita, Dr. Jennifer O'Mara and Professor Aljosa Smolic joining us online. We had a sneak peek of Aljosa there just a few moments ago. And they're going to be combining angles around human psychology and digital technology and aesthetics to kind of really dissect this question around avatars and digital personas and how that impacts on things like inclusivity and identity and social dynamics. So this is not going to be, just an easy, superficial discussion. I think we're really going to try and get under the surface of those issues. Now, a central question for this was posed when you would have registered to get your ticket to come here today, is whether avatars and digital personas should be considered humans. So before we actually get going, I would like to ask everyone in the room and everyone online in some shape or form of raising a hand or not, do you think avatars and digital personas should be considered human? Raise your hand if the answer is yes. Literally one person in the room. A few people, I think someone's just holding a mobile phone. I thought there was maybe 2. Raise your hand if you think the answer is no. Okay, the majority. And I guess there might be a few don't knows, haven't decided yet. So let's see who they are. Okay. So we might come back to this question at the end because it might be interesting just to revisit this. So before I introduce the first speaker, I'm just going to give you a sense of how this session will run. Each speaker will speak for about 5 minutes each, give or take, a slide or 2. Then we will have a bit of a panel discussion and open up to the floor. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the comments or just make a note of them. We will be definitely taking questions from the floor. So first up is Kata, who is a Human Plus Research Fellow at the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute here at Trinity. And Kata, you are the one who curated this panel and chose that question that you put your hand up for, but no one else did. Before you start your presentation, can you give us a sense of why you chose this topic and why you're also bringing in Jennifer and Aljosa to discuss it with you?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Honestly, I was surprised to be the only one with my hand up, but so the whole idea is behind this topic and behind the discussion of how identity and how behavior is shaped by digital personas is the fact that communication and a lot of activities are moving online, and these online spaces where people are represented by digital personas have its own social system, its own social dynamics. So in a lot of cases, there are overlaps with behaviors in the physical world. That includes also the appearance of people and the way they interact with each other, the way they behave. But at the same time, it's easy to hide behind digital personas. So in many cases, it's hard to decipher whether this is a real person, whether this is something that follows an algorithm, or whether this real person is representing their own selves. So I've been for quite a long time interested in social behavior in virtual spaces and online spaces, and how exactly immersive environments and immersive technology would affect people's behaviors and interactions. And for me, it's very much about the human side of it. It's very much about how these digital and immersive spheres change our behaviors and our ideas of and understandings of the things that are happening to us. So for me, it's very, very much rooted in human behavior and human psychology. So for me, it's obvious that these are considered as humans, but at the same time, these humans or these personas, we can say that if we don't really want to define them as humans, these personas are very much dependent on the technological affordances, the technological functions, and the ways in which we can engage with each other through something that is artificial.
Brilliant. And I can't wait to hear about your research and then also the perspectives of Jennifer and Aljosa. So whenever you're ready to share those slides.
Yeah. And starting my video as well and share my screen. Yeah. So basically, what I was just explaining and just really shortly or briefly reflecting on that more and more of our social interactions are becoming digital. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, and it was definitely something that was catalyzed by or was highlighted during the pandemic when a lot of activities and interactions had to move online on various kinds of spaces, but virtual environments and immersive technology that involves virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality became tools for creating these worlds and creating these environments and spaces for different types of activities. So what we can say about, like, if you look at this picture as well, is that in these virtual environments, there are a variety of ways for people to represent themselves, and these include, changing one's appearance slightly or using some kind of fictional characteristics props or accessories or masks or whatever, but also completely changing one's appearance to fictional figures that would not even reflect on this person's or user's humanness. They're robots, skeletons, animals, etc., in which that you can take as your virtual personas. So there is definitely this dilemma whether the representation of humans in digital worlds would that affect, or how that would affect social behavior and social dynamics when we don't actually show our true selves. And again, that's not something very new, because obviously every day we go about and go to work and go to places with, I don't know, dressing up, wearing makeup, brushing our hairs, or just, presenting a picture of us that we want to show to others in certain types of social scenarios. And this appearance is very often tied to certain social scenarios and behavioral frameworks. So even that appears even in real life, and this is enhanced in these digital worlds where no one actually knows what you look like if you appear as a skeleton, or if you appear with pink hair, or in any shape and form. And so my idea, or the whole idea of this discussion now, is rooted in the three pillars of digital personas and digital representations that I find important when addressing these problems and this phenomenon. And this is why I am really excited about this discussion and bringing Jennifer and Aljosa and also Jess into this discussion, because I think it's important to cover these areas of aesthetics, of technology, and of behavior and social dynamics in this picture. So this is a very simplified division of what our perspectives of this topic, but mine is the grey one with behavior, and we'll say a few words about that, not repeating myself. So digital personas can appear in many shapes and forms, in different extended reality platforms, or in different digital spaces. They don't even have to be immersive spaces, but digital spaces, and they have a variety of functions, not just a simple representation of the person that they are there, or they engage in an activity, but also they have aesthetic functions. They have functions in representing a certain personality, and also there are various ways to presenting ourselves in different social scenarios. So the reason why I put these pictures together, to see like all these different functions, and how I guess Jennifer will talk a little bit more about the aesthetic part of it, but how the representation of digital bodies is also very often dependent on what we are doing in certain virtual or digital spaces. So, for example, in a work meeting, in virtual reality, it's very often customizations of avatars or digital personas is very often limited to, formal attires, to representations that don't really go into any extremes. Whereas on the in this bottom right picture, that's the concert. So in that case, the representation of this artist that goes beyond the traditional everyday representation of or everyday appearance of a person, and goes more into some kind of an artistic expression. And also everyone's favorite Zoom event from, is it 2021 or 2020? I'm not sure. Is how the change of one's digital representation. And here we're talking about a Zoom conversation where, again, like one can use various digital personas, could affect the whole, not just how the others will engage with the specific person, but also the whole power dynamics and all the different layers of social dynamics in these digital spheres when someone in an official meeting happens to appear as a cat and trying to figure out how not to be a cat and justify that they are in fact not one. But again, so it was quite a comical situation, but it shows very well how just the change of representation can change behaviors as well. So basically, my take or my approach to this topic in digital personas has or focuses on three main implications: the social, the cognitive, and the embodied implications. And I put together a few questions that is something that reflects on these different implications. So social implications would reflect on how extended reality or digital media experiences would affect social dynamics towards various populations that are represented by digital personas, by fictionalized personas, or personas that represent real-world characteristics. In terms of cognition or cognitive implications, the question would be how we would comprehend and react to different social, cultural, and behavioral cues when we are interacting with digital personas and not face-to-face with physical bodies. And the embodied aspect relates to how the awareness of one's own body that has certain characteristics, and when the on-screen body is different from that, how would that affect a self-identity? How would we actually get to identify with our digital personas? So that's it from me. I'll stop the sharing.
Thank you so much, Kata. Your research reminds me of when I had to create my own avatar to enter alt space, and I had a minor existential crisis in the act of doing so. And then you talked to other colleagues who, just did it in a second, and we did some further research. And some people, just wanted to give me a random avatar, and yet there were some elements that I found deeply personal. So I'm interested to see what questions you might get based on those implications. And as Kata referenced, Jennifer's now going to be talking about the aesthetics of digital avatars. And we were talking very briefly before this, and she promised me that she's going to go beyond realism in this. So I'm very intrigued to see how you do that, Jennifer.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. So as mentioned, I'm coming at this from film studies, from a screen studies perspective. And one of the things I'm interested in with digital avatars, and particularly at the moment with augmented reality, where you have a merging of physical real world events and people, and then digital kind of costumes or filters or sort of superimpositions. So in terms of thinking about this, I want to kind of historicize the representations on the aesthetics that we can see at play with different forms of digital avatars. I'm particularly thinking about, going beyond realism, thinking about the potentially abstracting and liberating potential of these digital bodies, that they can rework the body to go beyond, actual representation in terms of, what we're born with, the bodies that we are kind of given and develop over time. And thinking about how some of the trends that we see in terms of things like augmented reality, where people kind of create new versions of themselves that are a mix of real world and digital filters, can link back to various sort of artistic and filmic movements, including surrealism, where again you have the idea of realism kind of at its focus and something that's sort of experimented with and moved away from. Thinking also about how it relates to something like Cubism in terms of art history, or to movements like the Dada kind of experimental movements that came about in kind of the early 20th century, initially in Europe. So seeing the body as it's represented in avatars as something that is plastic almost, that it can be molded and that it can be used expressively. So I think part of the potential with digital avatars is that they can allow us to see the self anew, to experiment with self-representation, for example. So I'm giving the example here where I've combined a few filters that I accessed using Instagram a few years ago, and looking at some of the similarities between the black and white images, which are from the experimental film Ballet Mécanique, which was a Dadaist post-Cubist art film made by the artist Fernand Léger, collaborating with the filmmaker Dudley Murphy and the photographer Man Ray. So they were using analog methods and experimental cinematography, but what they were aiming to do, or one of the aims, was to present the human body in new ways and to combine this with the kind of mechanization that was taking place in Europe at that time, that increasingly they were experiencing the rise of machine culture, things like carnival rides were emerging, and some of those are incorporated into this film, and factories and all of those kinds of mechanical dynamics were being played with in this film. So the details of mouths, for example, have become kind of extracted and presented in close up. And the figure has been kind of moved into different parts in a similar way to seeing the machines in that way. So one thing that I'm particularly interested in, coming kind of from a film studies perspective, and as someone who has an interest in film costume, I teach a module on film costume, for example, is thinking about avatars, for example, as a form of digital costume, that we can look at this from a kind of creative arts perspective, whether it's theatre or film or other screen media, and thinking about how avatars, again, offer this potential to transform the way our body is presented, but that this can also have a knock-on effect on our behaviour. So whether it's in terms of how we want to perform, or even as Kata goes into in more detail, the kind of the psychology of this, the impact it can have maybe on our cognition, our perception. So thinking about how in seeing ourselves differently as we work through these digital avatars, and often if you're using augmented reality, the version of yourself that you're presented with, you're watching it on screen. So it's kind of been mirrored back to you. And I think, this ability then for it to change our body language or our behavior, as I think a lot of people learned, earlier in the pandemic, in terms of seeing themselves on screen via meetings or via Zoom, the ability or the kind of the sudden awareness of your body and moving it in different ways, in a way that you weren't aware of before. And with these avatars, of course, you're getting that kind of real-time correspondence to seeing how you look in the real world is then being represented on the screen in a slightly different form. And then other aspects that I think we can think about in relation to avatars is their potential for storytelling, their potential for creating story worlds. So again, these are really kind of basic experiments, I say, that I did in Zoom using virtual backgrounds and using Snapchat filters. These are done during teaching. And in each case, in the first case, it's combining a Snapchat filter with the background from the expressionist film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And in recording this, seeing how quickly the kind of in watching yourself in this form on screen, the tendency was to kind of to do things to create a better kind of form of synchronization, or a better match with the background, the wanting to move your body into shapes that go better with the kind of this oblique lines in Caligari, for example, of blinking a lot because your eyes are suddenly whited out and they really stand out in that way. Thinking about how with the GIF that's playing in the bottom left, where your face is replaced by this giant baby's head, and there is a real sort of disembodiment effect, something quite jarring, because in order, even when you're watching yourself on screen, and I was touching my face on screen as this crazy doll, but in reality I wasn't. My hands were much lower. So a strange sense in which what you see on screen is not mimicking your actual real world body. So I'll just finish up by mentioning, that there is some really interesting research beginning to come out on this kind of technology and their uses, and including their uses for kind of things like performing arts. So this is just one citation, going back to 2017, where these authors experimented with using an augmented reality mirror in a museum space and in an opera hall to try and have characters, or to have characters within the opera use it to kind of get more into character, to what they describe as stepping into character, but also that people going to a museum could kind of better understand potentially this history that they were exploring in the museum space by, getting to try on these filters. But again, even things like this, of course, raise kind of issues around identity politics and, when it is or is not kind of appropriate to try on different bodies. I know this is something that, Kata's project looks at in more detail, the kind of, just because you can, take on different avatars of maybe different races or ethnicities or genders, is it right to do this? Is this the kind of the terms that might be used might be sort of digital blackface or something like that, where you're superficially representing other cultures and races, but without, obviously going through that as an actual lived experience, and the potential for that to be obviously really kind of problematic and exploitative. But I will leave it on that note. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I love how you both touch on the potential for liberation, but also that kind of caution around digital appropriation, I suppose. And then so to our last speaker, who is joining us online, Professor Aljosa Smolic is a lecturer at AR and VR at Lausanne University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Switzerland. You're very welcome. I am curious though, Aljosa, if you raised your hand for that question at the beginning, if avatars and digital personas should be considered human.
No, I did not raise my hand.
Okay, just checking. I couldn't see you when you did it.
No, I didn't raise my hand, but they should be something. There should be some form of legal person or some sort of an accountable person, right? So I think that we should have identities in this upcoming worlds that are also accountable and responsible for things that they are doing in these worlds. But that's something we can maybe discuss when we go on. I'm wondering if you can see my screen.
You can.
Just in
I see the full thing. Okay, well, thanks a lot. So I prepared a few slides and I will be very fast with that. So that goes back. So I'm now in Lucerne, at Hochschule Lucerne, but I've been for many years with Trinity College, heading the vSense lab and also founding the Hologram. So what I'm telling and showing is related to all of these things, obviously. And as a computer scientist, I'll give a bit more the technical perspectives related to social VR or the metaverse, as some people may call it, although it's not clear what that is. No? But let's assume that there is this network of persistent virtual worlds that are interactive and immersive in some way, where we are represented as a digital persona. We can go in, we can do things. We can own things, so there can be NFTs or items that we belong or trade. All of that belongs to this space. Some people also see it as an evolution from 2D web pages now into 3D spaces that we populate with ourselves in the end, if we want, right? And Outspace VR, Jess already mentioned that. That's one of these platforms owned by one of the tech giants, Microsoft. Meanwhile, there is also Horizon, owned by Meta. No? So there can be these extensions of existing social networks. But there can also be things that are decentralized, that are not owned by a particular company, that are based on the blockchain, and that may open completely new opportunities also for decentralized ownership of things in this virtual world. But that's another different story, right? But here in this example, you also see that we will go in there, we will be represented by our digital persona or avatar, and we can decide to mimic ourselves, but we can also express ourselves and be whoever and whatever we want, right? So you see here a few examples of persona that are completely different. And so there's a lot of criticism about this, but we could also see that really as an opportunity also for underprivileged people to be, to do things that they couldn't do in the real world, right? So what can you do there, for instance? And one thing, so you can go in there, you can have events, you can meet people as their avatars. And so this is something that was done by Gareth, who's back there in the room. So hi, Gareth. So you can refer to him for any questions of this work that he is carrying on also at Trinity College. So he put up this virtual world of this model of Trinity College Dublin. It's a complete model of the campus. So you can go in there and meet people like you see here. The model itself was done by Professor Carol O'Sullivan in the project Metropolis more than 10 years ago, but now it is available online. And you see, you can also teleport to other places. So that's a model on Clontarf Beach, which is also close to Gareth's home, as I know, and very much related to projects around COVID that he was doing in this context. So there's a number of publications around such work. You know? So this is actually the avatars of my class from Lucerne who are visiting now Trinity College, hosted by Gareth, who was showing us around here. You know? So this is one of an example of what can happen in these worlds. You know? And that's another small example of my nice little hometown, Aarau in Switzerland now, where I also created a virtual model of that you can go in. And here is an Outspace VR selfie of myself in this world. That's this digital representation of myself maybe 2 years ago. And you see, I chose to be quite photorealistic. So I tried to copy myself with these means that drove Jess so crazy, as she mentioned. So I selected from the opportunities to create such a cartoonish avatar of myself that, yeah, it's more or less like I would look like. Here you see how I do look like nowadays, and also this real environment, and it also kind of illustrates this relation of these virtual worlds versus the real worlds that can mimic and copy each other, but don't have to, right? So there is some decision about how people are designing themselves as persona in the metaverse or in these social media. And that's also something that we were investigating with our classes. So we took data from I think over 100 students, where we investigated what were the decisions for designing themselves. And Gareth is just the first author on all of this work. Yeah, so there are technological limitations as well to that, as well as preferences that people have. And I don't know if you've seen this example. So this is Zuckerberg, who at some point appeared on the internet represented as this avatar, which is quite cartoonish, not very photorealistic. And it created an outcry on the internet saying that, well, if this is the metaverse, then what do we need it for? And people were really bashing this very much. Then later, they released another version of that avatar, which is a little bit more photorealistic, so technically more advanced, but still not like he would look in real life. No? So there is obviously a dimension of photorealism that is associated with these digital avatars. No? But generally, they allow us to identify and to express ourselves. They should also have some responsibility and accountability. And in these virtual worlds, they will also allow us something like digital ownership of items that we may carry around. But in terms of photorealism, what you see here is an avatar. So it's a two-dimensional video that was purely created from text input through artificial intelligence. So it's a company called Synthesia that does some neural rendering and is able to do really photorealistic looking avatars. And right, so if you compare back to what we've seen there, the cartoonish style of avatar, that's maybe the future. No? So it's at this point, it's only very limited. It's only 2D video, but you can extrapolate that into the future, and we'll see that through technology at some point, we will most likely be able to have photorealistic avatars as well. No? And if I may, and still have a minute of time, that's also related to some work that we have been doing at Trinity College, and that is also from our startup company Volograms. So the idea is to bring real people into virtual reality, into the metaverse by, specific algorithms that, for instance, capture a person doing something and that turn this person into some three-dimensional representation. And once you have that three-dimensional representation, you can integrate it into these virtual worlds. No? It becomes an asset that can then be integrated into AR, as you see on the left-hand side, as a Snapchat filter, or in various types of applications. I'm jumping through this a little bit quick because I want to show this. So we did also a project together with the Long Room Hub, reconstructing a part of the Long Room, and also bringing a person, an actor dressed as Jonathan Swift in there. So you can virtually visit now this space and meet Jonathan Swift, or you can in AR go into the library with an AR device and see Jonathan Swift appearing there. Now, so that means digital persona, photorealistically looking people brought into these applications. Another project we were working on to bring the novel Ulysses to life, the first episode of it. So this is Buck Mulligan, one of the characters of the opening scene on Martello Tower in the south of Dublin. Just very quickly, also bringing real people into VR is the topic that I want to highlight here. And that's also something that our startup is looking at. So this is now an app that you can download to your phone, and it will allow you also to create such 3D digital humans of someone performing. And once you have that, you can do whatever you would do otherwise. You can bring in these people into various types of user-generated content, but also different types of professional applications are possible, and we are investigating those obviously as well in project. No? So that was a little bit the take here. No? So to say that photorealism is certainly one of the dimensions that will be looked at in the coming years. No?
Much, Aljosa. I was reminded your Altspace avatar actually looks a lot like a colleague of mine in Altspace, and yet you look very different in real life. And I'm quite curious, like as we edge towards photorealism, as you've been demonstrated, like gosh, things have come on so much relatively recently, how that realism will affect how we interact with each other. Curious as to your take on that, and I'll also ask you guys the same.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain danger also that comes with photorealism that is also often discussed because it allows fake news, and you've seen this video that allows to create all sorts of fake news, and that will also, if you extrapolate that, and one day we will be able really to meet in a virtual world as photorealistic holograms, so it becomes indistinguishable between reality and these representations. It will raise a lot of ethical questions, obviously, that should be discussed and addressed by people like you in the room, obviously. Yes.
Well, let's do that. I feel like there was an invitation to start opening up some of those questions. Kind of when you're thinking about how, like you're obviously looking at behavior, you're like, that's your thing. It's right. I'm always struck by the lack of mirrored surfaces when I enter VR, like virtual worlds. But if we have this very photorealistic avatar and we're looking at those, how's that going to maybe change our behavior and the ethics around that?
I would actually approach it from the other direction of like non-photorealism. Because I would say that right now in many virtual spaces, representations are tied to the function and less to a realistic representation of a person, which limits a lot of social cues. For example, the avatar that Aljosa was showing, like that one that doesn't have an arm, it could be, you know, a representation of a person, and can I see the characteristics, your characteristics, Aljosa, behind the digital representation. But there are a lot of things missing that we rely on in everyday social scenarios to interact with each other, to understand each other, because of these limitations. But at the same time, when we say that we have photorealistic representations, and then we take ourselves into this digital world, would it be, again, like, would it be us, or would it be still some kind of a alternative persona, even if it looks the same? And what you're saying about these mirrored surfaces, to see ourselves looking the same way, what I see is that if that happens in a virtual world, that enhances the whole idea that there is no difference between the virtual world and the physical world. It can be, again, very, very difficult in terms of ethics, but at the same time could be practical in a way that could bridge gaps, like geographic or physical gaps between people. But right now there are so many virtual spaces where even though there might not be mirrored surfaces, but there are the avatar customization platform. Pretty much when you enter a virtual world, this is the first thing you have to do, and then you see yourself through this designs, very often stereotypical characteristics, where two people, like you said, who look different in real world would look the same in terms of avatar because they have the same hair color and basic characteristics. That's so limiting that you actually bump into someone who looks exactly like you, and that doesn't help this kind of communication situations.
Thank you, Kata. And in a moment, we are going to throw questions out to the floor. There's already one in from the live stream, which I will ask in a moment. But I'd love to ask Jennifer one, because you were drawing on that art historical approach. And I'm curious as to how contemporary art movements today might influence the future of how we create avatars, and even perhaps how photography as an art form is today influencing that move towards photorealism in avatars. Have you looked into that or explored that at all?
Not that particular question, but I do think that what you're seeing increasingly, especially on sites like Instagram, where you have, huge demographics of young people using filters, and there's some, worrying research, for example, around teenagers, as people as young as teenagers getting plastic surgery to try and look more like their augmented selves, because they create a kind of what they see as being, the ideal version of themselves that they then want to, match in the real world. I think that's one of the kind of the dangers of it is, becoming overly attached maybe to these virtual versions of ourselves and wanting to then map that back onto reality. I suppose one of the things that always comes to mind to me when you start to talk about photorealism in relation to avatars or, any kind of screen representations is the term, for example, the uncanny valley, which I'm sure lots of people here, who study technology or robots or anything like that have come across in terms of the way that humans generally can respond quite poorly to representations or recreations that very closely mimic or, come close to approximating humans, and that they're almost more comfortable with slightly more cartoonish versions, for example. And it's interesting with the Mark Zuckerberg example to think about that. And, is this partly, getting at that? I know that's something that's happened in relation to the film industry and responses to different forms of computer-generated imagery that's been created, and with certain films where they move towards a very photorealistic model, and people found it very jarring, and particularly because things like eyes are extremely hard to recreate in sort of photorealistic forms of animation and computer generated imagery, and people very quickly perceive that and find it very strange if the eyes, look vacant. They don't have the same kind of responsiveness to light that they would in real life, and we can pick up those very small changes very easily. And so sometimes we're more comfortable with something that's more artificial than something that's better, more closely appropriates or approximates reality.
It's interesting how you mentioned kind of people having the cosmetic surgery and also uncanny valley, because sometimes in real life, when people have too much cosmetic surgery, I find myself entering the uncanny valley. We've got a really interesting question that's come in, and I think I'm going to throw it to you first, Kata, just heads up here from Robert, because it's talking about research into digital avatars, posthumous digital avatars, and how they affect the grieving process. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, digital avatars in death, I suppose. Is this taken into account when designing these spaces?
Yeah, there are artistic and technology projects around that, like how we can actually recreate humans to be with us in the same space, and you don't actually have to as far as to grieving or death. It can also be just physical distance and bringing someone closer. But I think, and this is actually really interesting in relation to the question that you launched this whole discussion with, is whether these are real humans or considered as real humans. Digital personas would be considered as real humans, because there might be a digital persona that doesn't have a human behind it, or no longer, or it's detached from physical reality. I don't actually think I want to go into the moral side of it, but it's but this whole idea is when is the point that we can accept or would perceive our digital presence as like the real thing, so that we could engage with all those others, objects or humans that are in there, as considering them as some, like things and people who are near us or who we can interact with.
So the question is, did Tupac actually play Coachella? I'm going to open to some more questions from the floor. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask? Martina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. And I think my question kind of follows up on what you were just saying about digital personas. And but it's for, the entire panel here. We have heard today, digital personas, digital humans, digital avatars, digital identities. So why did you choose to go for digital personas and not for maybe another definition? And this is kind of the first question. So if you can provide me a definition of what a digital persona is. And the second one, I think elaborating on this, when I think of digital personas, Facebook profile could be a digital persona. An avatar in VR, XR, of course, can be a digital persona, but also a digital identifier, a biometric record. I don't know, an anonymous token holder in a DAO, in a decentralized autonomous organization. Is that a digital persona too? And are the same, like, can we consider them all on the same levels or no? So that's the question.
Aljosa, you're online. Would you like to?
Yeah, no, I really like this question, and I discussed it very controversially in a number of occasions already, right? So what should be our digital identity, and how is it connected to the different data and tracks that we leave on the internet and elsewhere, right? Because it's true, today we are largely identified through our email address, right? So all the accounts that you have, all your entry, which is a bit of a persona, a bit of you, if you have a Facebook account or your whatever account you have, you go in with some signature that you have that also lets you identify and that makes you accountable in case you are doing bad things in the internet. No? And so the question is, if this vision continues and we really build this network of persistent virtual worlds that we are in there, should we also have something like a digital identifiable unit that can be traced and followed back, and that you can also use to go from account to account in some way, and something like a passport. We have a passport, we can travel in the real world through our passport, and towards the police we are responsible through that, right? So the question is, should there be something like that in the digital world as well? And if yes, who should be the governing organization, right? So and that gets really difficult, and I don't have a good answer to that, right? So my intuition is that I would like to have something like that, right? So that that you are accountable and responsible and traceable in the internet. But I don't have a good answer how that would work on blockchains and in all these things that are evolving and developing. But I think it's a central and difficult question, absolutely. But I don't have an answer.
Well, if I can just add to that, I think it's a really, really important question, and also very interesting to divide the questions of self-identity from technological representation and social representation. And there are all these different terms. There's no really a consensus because these terms are just, popping up and they're not really a definition. But I think it's important to divide these. How do I identify in these digital worlds, not only through the way I represent myself aesthetically, but also what Aljosa is talking about, like what kind of identifiers exist that go together with that. Whereas when we talk about, for example, avatars or the digital representations, it's more about technology. It's not necessarily about how we choose to represent ourselves, but what that specific platform allows. So like how much customization it would allow, how much of, body language it enables. And I think it's important also to reflect on how we are representing ourselves differently in different social scenarios, even in real world, in different social functions at work, at home, and in different scenarios. So that's similar to that as well. The problem is, or maybe it's not a problem, but the challenge or the novelty here is that the digital representation can change so much more radically than our body representations in real life cannot. Mm-hmm. So I think it's also important to reflect on that.
I'm picking up from that. I'm just going to get to a question that's coming online, and Jennifer, I might bring you in here, particularly because I know your research has actually looked at this issue around intersectionality as well. And I think that's applicable here. The question is that science fiction includes mentions of people living with disabilities who use a fully able avatar. Would the panel think they should disclose the truth online or just go about their business?
I think, there's a lot of stuff kind of going on there. I mean, like it goes back in a way to what I was saying about the freedom and the liberating potential of having digital bodies, and that they can allow us in a way, if we want to go beyond, our physical selves in whatever way we want. So if that means choosing to represent yourself in a different way, when it comes to a kind of disability of some kind, then I don't see why that would be an issue. But I mean, I think it's more problematic, if we think about what we're saying about kind of whether it's race or gender or doing things in a way that might be seen as like the motivation, I suppose, behind it. If it's just to sort of experience the world in a different way versus to kind of take advantage or appropriate another, for example, sort of the lived experience of minorities, for example, then I would say that is potentially more of an issue. than with someone who wants to kind of explore a world in a different format. In the same way that you have things like gaming, where obviously people have always had choices with regard to what characters they use, or how they choose to play the game, and the kind of personalization aspect. So I don't see that would be one of the kind of the ethical issues really. But I don't know, Kata, do you have anything else on that, or anyone else? Or sorry.
Yeah,
Do you want to say it? Yeah. And then we'll go.
I was just thinking how what you said, going beyond the physical self, and when, like, to what extent it is okay to do that, and what extent it is not, and virtual reality, for example, and a lot of these digital technologies that enable appearing in someone, like in a fictional entity, or not necessarily fictional, but some kind of a representation. And there's this question around it, whether you represent who you are and how much you identify with this digital self. So I guess it's just the question is, in terms of disabilities, for example, is how these digital personas would enable new types of activities that the physical body doesn't enable. But at the same time, would others need to know about that? I think that's pretty much the point, that it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to align with the physical self.
Yeah. That line between the liberation again, and then the limitations. Pat, and then we'll go to Shane. If there are any other questions, you probably just have time for these three. Okay, good.
Yeah. I think my question goes in a similar vein, and because I feel like this is such a brilliant question about identity then that you're raising here, and but going back to social cultural practices, and especially the idea of, I would say, some form of empowerment, or moving beyond realism, isn't it also moving beyond social norms in a certain way? And if that is, tiny question, because, when we're moving from beyond realism to photorealism in technology, how does this work together? And where do you see the potential points of probing more experimental, artistic avatar versions or technologies, and how could this, also relating to the Human Plus, your collaboration on that, how could that work, that we can create technologies in a way that do not produce avatars because that just, to me, it sounds a bit like a reduction, reduce avatars to photorealistic representations of something that might not be my identity in a way, or reduce my identity, or whatever, limit my capacity to interact socially. That would be my question. Is it a question? I don't know. But
we'll probably only have time to hear from one person on the panel, and I feel so I guess jumping in. Go on.
You feel the virtual presence from the side. I fully agree that photorealism is a restriction to something, but this is good for some things and not good for other things. So if you want to express yourself and go beyond the physical, then the ability to design an avatar the way you want it is the way to go. But if you, for instance, want to do a human conversation like this one with a person that you feel like is really the person, then you will want to have it as photorealistic as possible, like in this situation that we are in now. So I think from a technology, from my perspective, all of it is interesting, and we are interested in developing that and investigating these things. But both of them will have different application scenarios. That's how I see it. Yeah.
It's all of it. So there were two more questions from people in the room, and I'd love just to hear from both of them, and then we'll have some brief responses to wrap. So Shane, I know you had your hand, and the lady will send this side as well. What was your question?
Sure. I'm interested in sort of, I guess, some of what's been touched on about how digital representation, obviously for people with disability or for anybody to represent themselves we reach the limits of technology. So somebody with a disability, maybe an amputee, they can't present with one arm if they want to. Nobody can have legs when the platform doesn't let anybody have legs. But I thought there was some really interesting comments made earlier about the plasticity of our presented identity. I think how we present in the physical world as you might dress as a goth as a signifier to connect with other people. We might wear a red MAGA hat. There are ways that we already express ourselves in how we present in the physical world. Does that, I'm interested, I guess, just in what the technology also enables in more rapid communication. Does a presented identity become not just photorealistic or be who and what we always are, but we potentially might see the emergence of new cultural norms where identity becomes a form of communication and maybe more rapid communication than.
And I'm just going to take the other question as well because we're near the end. It's not a MAGA hat, but it is a red hat that you're wearing. What was your question as well or comment?
I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I'm thinking in line with operating in societies where we don't have so much freedom of expression. I'm a researcher and an activist. As a researcher, there's no problem. But as an activist, I advocate for the right of girls to education. Sometimes you get yourself in trouble. And so I'm looking at how I can take this forward to represent myself with an avatar and still be able to, make, do my activism, make comments about what government is not doing right, about what some group of people are doing against, the vulnerable, and still get away with it.
But getting there. And I love how it's still about, representing yourself, as we heard from Shane, but also then if I want to do these things about freedom of expression, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, I have so much to say about it. I have no idea how to.
But we're going to have to do it in a minute because we're going to wrap up soon.
I know, because it's there's so many layers to it, both of your questions, and I absolutely agree that the way how humans are represented in this digital world are defined by technology, and that is definitely that leads to different and new social and cultural norms, because there are limitations of expression. There are different ways of expression, different ways of experimentation with how one presents themselves, and obviously these digital words I very often praised for the whole idea that if one cannot express their true identities in the physical world for whatever reason, they can do it there, and that has positive implications for social behavior, for mental health, etc. But can also have limitations because there will be new ways of communicating with each other, just because of the fact that we don't assess that much information or that many cues from each other. And we'll probably have to stop.
Well, I think with all of your presentations, and in fact all of the questions, I think we've just uncovered a whole other set of questions to be talking about and debating. And thankfully this talk is a series of talks, so there's going to be loads of opportunities to talk more about it. The next one is actually on the 11th of October, hosted by Pat Troish on robots on our everyday lives. And there's definitely some things there that I think I'm kind of fascinated by, kind of robots, but you're thinking about, how they can also be avatars. I wonder, will some of these questions also...
And the Uncanny Valley.
And the Uncanny Valley, for sure. So very much looking forward to that one on the 11th of October. We are right at time, and I'm sure people have places to go when it hits 2:00. So I just want to finish up by saying a massive big thank you to Aljosa, Jennifer and Kata in the room. And let's give them a big round of applause.
And thank you, Jess.